So it's my pleasure to add my welcome to all of you and to introduce Tom Petrie, who will come back to this issue of energy and in particular energy independence for the U.S. or at least maybe for North America. He's had a vantage point in a long career in energy investments and banking that gives him a way to tell us about this that I think will be very useful. He's now chairman of Petri Partners, but worked with Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and other investment firms in his career. And he's been involved in one way or another in about something more than $200 billion of energy-related mergers and acquisitions. So I guess that gives him some sort of an indication of what people are willing to invest in. So please join me in welcoming Tom Petrie.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and have a chance to share with you some perspectives on where we are. I think with the stage that's been set by Secretary Shultz, this is a great time to be focusing on the nature of the opportunity and what risks or issues we may encounter as we move forward in taking advantage of it and making sure that we don't squander that opportunity. I will get into my perspective on U.S. import dependence and what it means in terms of our energy flexibility moving forward. What I'd like to do is fairly briefly speak to how did we get to where we are today. Some of this will be repetition for you who've heard me speak here before, but I think it's an important backdrop, and I'll do it as succinctly as possible, talking about the factors you see here on the slide. And then I'm going to define how I see today's transformed outlook, all of that for a background to assess some of the risks to development, some of the issues that, if handled correctly, will go fine, and if not handled correctly, end up being a process of suboptimization. And then a few concluding thoughts. The oil price supercycle is one worth commenting on for a moment, because what this chart really shows, it encompasses my entire career from 1971, when I left the Army, to the present. And I think it demonstrates as well as I know how to that while oil prices are a function of supply and demand, by virtue of the nature of geopolitical issues that can affect that supply and demand availability, or at least the perception of that availability. This is an event-driven industry. This is fundamentally a geopolitically oriented industry. And we should always keep that in mind. It goes right to what Secretary Shultz spoke about in terms of our interests in the Middle East, being rather independent of our energy independence, if you will. I also want to talk about the M&A cycle. This is a terribly complex slide. But the simple way to summarize it is, on the left-hand side, just after World War II, we had some 45 pretty significant oil and gas companies. And through the years and through three major cycles, one in the 80s, the first half of the 1980s, another in the late 90s when the super majors were created, and then another one in post-2000, when there was a major consolidation of independents. We boiled that down to about 12 players through the first two cycles, and then we reconstituted many of the independent players in a way that's largely responsible for what we now call the unconventional fossil fuel revolution. The main thing that hit me when I was writing my book, Following Oil, is that just how much this was a process of creative destruction, if you will, whereby through the consolidation process of many of those mergers and acquisitions, there were downsizings and reorganizations that freed up human capital that linked itself to new sources of capital and new ideas in terms of human capital as to where and how to unlock more hydrocarbons. And much of what we see today is the fruit of that process. And it's one of the most positive aspects, I think, I experience and believe in that M&A consolidation process. It's not simply a consolidation down to just a duopoly or triopoly. In fact, it's a reconstitution of the business in a more focused and effective way. The other thing to keep in mind when we think about where we've come from is the old model. The old model was the one that M. King Hubbert talked about when he talked about peak oil. Peak oil was very much on our minds 10 years ago because we were seeing lots of evidence saying that it was right. But that old model involved the multiple risks of having hydrocarbons generated in the source rock, migrating in a timely way to reservoir rock and being effectively trapped. That's the product of each of the probabilities of those events. And it's a 1 in 6 chance at best in terms of wildcat drilling. The new model, which came when we had a epiphany, if you will, and we had an evolution of technology that enabled us to begin to drill what are called horizontal wells, and then to begin to stimulate those wells with multi-stage fracking. And that took the probability to an entirely different zip code, if you will. Basically, there's still risk, and as I'll summarize later, capital can still be destroyed, but the fundamental risks shifted so dramatically in favor of developing new supply cost effectively that we have what we have today. And I'll describe that in more detail here in a moment. A pivotal event in terms of a wake-up call for our industry, I think, occurred in a transaction in 2006, where the second major property in the Barnett Shale was sold. And the first one had been George Mitchell, having taken 17 years to be an overnight success, sold to Devon. But it's when Devon re-upped and paid at a premium to double up their position in the Barnett Shale that the wake-up call went out to the industry. If it'll work in the Barnett, why won't it work elsewhere? Within 9 months, 12 other plays were being pursued. They're depicted on this map. Within the next 2 or 3 years, 8 of those 12 had been validated, and the process continues today. So what we've had is a real game changer, without question. And as a result, you cannot pick up a paper today without some kind of news relating to that event. And I've summarized a few headlines here to capture the wide range of implications that one sees when you think about these headlines. The shale boom forecast is forecast to turn U.S. gas market upside down. To some it has. The Middle East oil fuels fresh China-U.S. tensions. Maybe so, but I would argue it's diminished them, if anything, vis-a-vis expectations that we would be going head-to-head with China in the old model of peak oil. Certainly the ability to work through whatever tensions there are is improved. The price of ignoring Middle East reality, and I'll talk about that some more in a moment. But basically, there's no question that the news is ubiquitous, and now it becomes a question of how do we deal with it? How do we understand it and deal with it effectively? There are basically powerful production increases in the offing, and I don't think anybody who's attended so far has much doubt about that. From the standpoint of participants in the industry, in this cycle that we're now dealing with, the land rush is largely over. It's now a question of efficiency, and if I were redoing the slide, I would add effectiveness of execution, which is critical. Effectiveness is important because, as you heard this morning, effectiveness includes environmental effectiveness, not just pure economic effectiveness in the short-term considerations. High grading of validated development projects is the new priority in every company that we see in our business who's got a stake in this play, or this set of plays. Avoidance of pitfalls is really something that still matters. Shell Oil, one of the technological leaders in the industry over decades, has recently taken a $2 billion write-off in some of its shale exposures. It's still possible to destroy capital and be exposed to this, even if you've eliminated much of the so-called wildcat risk. Oil and NGL potential in this country is probably fourfold better than what we thought when we had fear of peak oil in 2003, 4, and 5. Finally, natural gas potential. I suspect is something like tenfold better than we thought it was when we were building a host of regas facilities to bring in stranded gas from Africa and the Middle East, because we were presuming, based on the old model, that we were about to run out of it. Those plants were built on time and on budget, and they've operated at less than 10% of effective capacity since they were built. Luckily, we can reconfigure them another way and facilitate gas exports today. This is a chart from the MIT study from 2010. Like any prediction, we know it's going to be subject to change once you put it on paper and put it out. There's an interaction that occurs between these plays as they developed became competitive with each other. And I'll show you with a little bit of animation here what actually happened, where the Haynesville, the gas didn't go away, but it got squeezed down because it was not as economic as the gas from the Marcellus. The gas from the Marcellus will have a productive potential in 2017 by pretty authoritative forecasts exceeding that of the state of Qatar. That's, if you will, energy independence, or a big step in that direction. And there's more interaction than I've captured on this chart, but it's an important consideration as we think about what's happening. Here's what the IEA in Paris now forecasts to be the outlook for liquids, oil and NGLs in the United States, something that if you'd ask me or anybody else who spends pretty much full time thinking about this in 2004 or 5, do you think the US will ever get back to the old peak? I would have said no, very, very unlikely. If you passed again, what's the probability? I'd say less than 5%, maybe 2 or 3%. I sit here today declaring how unaware I was, and I think most people in the industry were, even those focused on it, of what the idea of moving light, tight oil would be all about, that big orange blob there. I used this in the last year's presentation, and since then, we're ahead of schedule. In fact, the reason we're ahead of schedule is last August, early September, the Eagle Ford down in Texas, on the Texas coast, depicted on this chart, reached 1 million barrels a day from virtually standstill 2.5 years ago. And up in the Bakken, it reached 1 million barrels a day of new output, basically in the fourth quarter of the year. So we're talking about large amounts of new output, 2 million barrels a day, that represents a dramatic turn. We're not back to the old peak yet, but the next 2 million barrels a day that'll take us there is within sight. So the real issue becomes, how do we make sure that we understand the benefits of that and the responsibilities that come with it, and what it does to transforming the U.S. position. This is another complicated chart, and these will be available later, I believe. I have no problem with them being available through the Precourt Institute. But to try to orient you to it, the point I'm trying to make here is the following. In 2010, we started with about a little over 17 million barrels a day of U.S. demand, and we satisfied that with 7 million barrels a day of U.S. production. We then relied on imports from Canada and the rest of the world for the bulk of the rest. As I now see it in 2018, we will have reduced that level of imports to something like 6 million barrels a day. We'll have had a significant reduction. And by the middle of the next decade, we will have cut it down even further. I don't get us to a barrel-for-barrel independence, which is something that's talked about fairly loosely in the press often. But I do see us having at least constructive independence, in that we're also going to be exporting meaningful amounts of natural gas under the policies of this administration that have been well enunciated and at this point executed, such that with those exports and with the kind of trade relationship we have with Canada, we will have constructive independence. It doesn't actually optimize us to have full barrel-for-barrel displacement of oil imports. we are configured to run heavy sour oil in this country. The industry's invested large amounts of money to do it and produce environmentally effective light products. But what we need to do is get the full benefit of what we are producing, and that involves a degree of export of some light oil while we're importing some heavy oil. And that's an issue that I think will be debated here in Congress and with the administration in the coming months or year or two. But the whole point of this, and there are people who look at this and say, you're way too conservative. We'll get to what you're talking about on the oil production side within the next year or two, and that's possible. And what you're talking about for 2025 could be achieved possibly by 2020. I would agree with that, but I would also caution people to remember, this is some of the most capital intensive and economically, environmentally sensitive oil being produced today. And therefore, I think there's a need to understand that going pell-mell to the largest amount of production without regard to those issues could be a mistake. It could be in the interest of OPEC to let prices fall and fall dramatically. The event-driven nature of oil pricing that I showed at the beginning is still a reality that I deal with day in and day out in advising clients. What I'm going to do now is just wrap up rapidly on the issue of what are the risks we deal with going forward from here, such that we don't squander this opportunity, but in fact embrace it effectively. When you see how effective that reduction in our import bill is, it's critical that we do this. 35 to 45% of our of our structural trade deficit that we've dealt with during most of my career, the last 4 decades, has come from our oil import bill. By getting to constructive import independence, we're going to really improve our trade position and our foreign debt financing position in the world. It's going to enhance our leadership platform if we do it right. But we do have to deal with environmental issues and constraints. You've heard a lot about that this morning. I would just say it's my view that the model that's been now adopted here in Colorado is a great model. I think the work that's been done, and you heard from the panel on this, is to be commended. And I'm very hopeful that it will now move to other states and be something with the same principles that were involved in doing it here will apply in other states where it's critical that continue. The infrastructure challenges, the energy price volatility, and the shifting global trends, I'll touch on those very briefly. On the environmental, just to take one more minute, fugitive methane has been for the last 3 or 4 years highest on my list of priorities for the industry to engage with. So what's happened is important. Anti-fracking, the main thing I worry about is in this era of social media, the ability to propagandize the electorate with less than fact-based information. And I would submit there are a couple of movies, 3 movies out that have done that effectively, and the media distribution of those has contributed to it. And it's unfortunate because there are issues to address, and they need to be addressed factually. They need to be addressed very, very effectively by the industry. The water quality issues, I think, are largely manageable, but they do need to be managed. It is, as Secretary Moniz said at this platform 2 years ago, water quality is much less of an issue, and there may be exceptions that I will admit, but it is much less of an issue of pollution of the aquifers, assuming good, solid, best-in-class construction of well design, than dealing with return frac fluids that need to be bioremediated. Lots is happening in that, and I'm fairly constructive about it. The rest of the air emissions involving dust and particulates and so on all need to be addressed. What I'm most encouraged by is how much more effective the industry's become in dealing with those sort of things. And so let me wrap up on price volatility. I do worry and believe that we will have future declines in the price of oil because somewhat perversely, it may well be in the interest of those who have large amounts of conventional oil to let that happen for a period in order to have it be a warning shot across the bow for development of more capital-intensive unconventionals. So one cannot rule that out. That said, I think the development that's already occurred is likely to help us dampen the volatility of future energy prices, and that's a very good thing from the standpoint of Western economic interests. The final point I would say is that we have a shifting globalization trend here that is, I think, very important. I've talked about it in my book, and I just take a moment. There's a power triangle that's evolved, and I talked about it last time, so I won't go through it in great detail, but it involves Russia, China, and Iran, because those are major suppliers of oil to China. It also involves potentially Iran, India, and China for other reasons, and it's not a complete triangle there because the third leg, but from India to China, is one that's challenging and problematic given a history of plenty that they have to disagree with that is on occasion turned into war. And finally, there's a Russia, Iran, India triangle. In the context of the U.S. de facto diminished interests or diminished presence in the Middle East, these power triangles become very important. And I worry about the conclusion that some may draw, and the question was very good from the audience on this. Does it mean we should not, as we get toward independence or constructive independence on oil, does that mean we shouldn't care about the Middle East? And I think that would be a very dangerous conclusion to draw, because there are so many other aspects to the geopolitics that we're dealing with today that to do that could be a mistake. But I will say, as a young Army officer in the late 60s, I was very struck by the UK withdrawal east of Suez. And to some degree, I find myself saying we're looking at what may be the beginning, what could at least for outward appearances be a US withdrawal that's at least roughly analogous to that. To the degree that's the case, I would submit that the four other players in these power triangles are likely to want to fill that vacuum, and we'd better be very prepared to understand the implications of that in far broader terms than solely oil import dependence for the United States. Let me wrap up very, very quickly with a few things. I think the opposition to fracking today is substantial, it's organized, and it's now being proactively addressed by the industry in multiple forums. It needs to be, because the danger of that propagandizing on it, as opposed to understanding it and then making very considered judgments, is going to be critical to not squandering the nature of the opportunity. When we analyze the alternatives, most environmental issues, I think, can be more effectively dealt with by this industry, and I'm very hopeful the recent steps on methane and air emissions here in Colorado become the model for that. And finally, the challenges of infrastructure build-out represent major opportunities for economic growth throughout the United States. We're going to talk about this in another session, so I'll come back to it, but it really is a case. It's not an accident that the U.S. is coming out of this last economic meltdown in better shape. And it's very much driven by what's happening in unconventionals. So let's hope that we can proceed with wisdom and with real balance in our environmental, our economic, and our security policy making. Thank you very much.
We have a few minutes for questions, so the cards will be coming around. So if you want to ask a question, I see that there are a couple down here already, and in principle, those will get delivered to me. Carl, let me have those, and then we'll work on those. But in the first instance, I will just take the prerogative of asking a question myself. So I noticed in your slide that dealt with North America, U.S. demand.
Yep.
that you had a steadily declining demand for oil in the United States. And I wanted to ask you to explain to all of us why you see that demand coming down.
Sure. Well, you know, there's a role, it's a very important role for conservation and efficiency measures. The new CAFE standards are important. Those are incorporated in those forecasts. And other efficiencies are going to be there. While I talk about worrying about a low price, if we have a low price test, I think it'll be fairly short and self-correcting. And I think the new reality is 80 to 90, maybe $100 domestic oil going forward. And that's a powerful incentive to not misuse this valuable commodity and to use it the best way possible. So I built that into my forecast.
Yeah, so that's an interesting challenge to the usual argument that there is that increases in demand in China and India and other big economies will more than take up the slack from that. Is there a chance of exporting the additional efficiency to those places as well?
I think there is over time. You know, one of the things, efficiencies take time because you do have embedded, sunk costs don't matter. It's only what is happening on the margin. So we're probably going to be ahead of the curve vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but I do believe we can be an example and it will be followed.
So here's a question from the audience that in this debate, for example, about natural gas and all its positive and negative impacts, the questioner wants to know how this impacts energy-intensive industries in the U.S.
Okay, I'm going to speak to that a little bit, but clearly prices have come down. Utilities are moving much more dramatically toward using gas, substituting for coal, and that's a good example where low prices have triggered. In the second session today, there'll be a chance to talk a little more about manufacturing and other downstream uses. Let me do it then in the interest of time.
Yeah, fair enough. Unfortunately, I have more good questions here than I have time for, but this one is a little bit different direction. It asks for comments on the question of coal to liquids, and I might just add to that question by saying, do you see any prospect that would compete in the world that we see ahead?
I'd be surprised. I'd be very surprised, and the reason is, and I could be corrected by people who know more than that in the audience, and probably will be, but that can be water intensive, as I understand it. So it's competing for another resource that has scarcity issues, and it's capital intensive. And frankly, I think it's potentially more capital intensive, barring some technological advances, than the development of the oil and gas unconventionals that we have today. So I think it's pushed out in all likelihood.
Yeah. All right. Well, alas, our time has expired. Thanks, Tom, for a very interesting view of the energy system ahead.
Thank you.